huge poster that's hanging in the Carlson Center. But eventually I got to know him through other areas. And when we started putting these sessions together, our goal was to have faculty from different disciplines talk about books. And I said, I know an economist who talks about books in ways that I understand. And I contacted Dan, and he agreed to do it. And then the information that I have about Dan has convinced me that he was a Renaissance man. Although before, when you write an economist and you say, would you like to do a book talk on a great book, maybe something in your field? And he immediately writes back and says, I'd like to do Slaughterhouse-Five. You know you're working with an individual who sees the world in a lot of different ways. Dan is a graduate of Blue Valley High School and K-State. Majored in economics and German, which is nice. He studied abroad for 3 years, a year in Berlin as a Fulbright scholar, a year in Madrid as a Rotary scholar, graduate work at the University of Texas at Austin and at UMKC. He's taught at several universities and was at KU recently, where he specialized in economic history of Europe and the United States, but he's joined us so he can focus on becoming a better teacher. And today he's going to teach us about Slaughterhouse-Five.
Oh. We'll start with a little slapstick. So all of this happened, more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. I really did know a guy who was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot. When I got back from World War II, but not a lot of words came to his sons full grown. I told the movie producer Harrison Starr once that I was writing a book on Dresden, and he said, "Is it an anti-war book?" I said, "Yes, I suppose it is." And he said, "You know what I say to people who say they're writing anti-war books? Why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead?" And I'll tell you, this is one nice thing about Vonnegut. A lot of authors would leave you there and let you figure that out, but he just loves to explain himself. And he says, what he meant, of course, was that wars would keep on coming like glaciers. And even if we didn't have wars, we'd still have plain old death. He goes back to Dresden and meets a taxi cab driver, Gerhard Müller. And this guy's driving him around Dresden, and he sends him a postcard later that says, "I hope we meet later in a world of peace and freedom in the taxi cab, if the accident will." And Vonnegut's like, I love that phrase, "if the accident will." And so that's one of the people he's dedicated the book to. He's also dedicated it to Mary O'Hare, because he goes and visits one of his old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare. And when he goes to their house, he thinks it's going to be like a couple of veterans drinking scotch and leather chairs, talking about war stories. And Mary O'Hare is furious at him. There's no leather chairs and a fireplace. There's an operating room. It's a Formica kitchen tabletop and one glass for Kurt Vonnegut to drink, and a 200-watt light bulb. And she's mad at him, and he can't figure it out because he was a nice guy. And finally she says, "You were babies back then." And Vonnegut's like, "It's true. We were 18-year-old virgins, Frank Sinatra and John Wayne." And then again, Vonnegut explains what that means. What she meant, of course, was that she thought books and movies encourage war. And so he says, "Mary, I don't think I'm going to finish this book, but if I do." After the war, I studied in Chicago. I studied anthropology, and they were teaching at the time that nobody was bad or disgusting. Right before he died, my father said to me, "You know, you never wrote a book with a villain in it." And I said, "Yeah, that's one of the things I learned in college after the war." Vonnegut has this taking his daughter and her friend off of Cape Cod for the first time. That's on the ocean in Massachusetts, if you don't know that. And he says, when we got to a river, we had to stop so they could get out and think about it for a while. They'd never seen water in that long, narrow, unsalted form before. You've never thought about a river like that in your life. And that's what he sort of has the power to do to our brains. He says they wore white party dresses and black party shoes so people would know right away how nice they were. And in this book is a very deep critique of 20th century American materialism. There's another line in here where he says, like a lot of Americans, she was trying to make a life that had meaning out of things she found in gift shops. And that's very funny, but it's a very sharp critique. I don't know about y'all, but I'm always looking for the really good satire. In our time, that's Amy Schumer, that's Louis C.K., that's Colbert, that the best of all of them, in my opinion, is Jon Stewart. It's Mark Twain. It's a guy named H.L. Mencken. It's Vonnegut. He's hilarious, but sometimes he makes you cry. Like he says in the first chapter, I have instructed my sons to never participate in massacres and to not rejoice when they hear that our enemies have been massacred, and to show contempt for people who think we need more massacre machinery. And then he ends the first, there's a lot of Judeo-Christianity in this book. He ends that first chapter quoting from the Bible. I brought my NIV. This is Genesis 19:24, if you're fastidious about that sort of thing. Because he's like, I'm thinking about Dresden, and I looked in the Bible for scenes of destruction. And he quotes this. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities and all the vegetation in the land. And then he says, so if you don't know this story, this is Lot was told to leave, and Lot has a wife. I don't know that we ever learned her name. But do we? I don't think we do. But Lot's wife is, don't look back at the city. And Vonnegut says at the end of the first chapter, but Lot's wife did look back, and I love her for that, because it was so human. So she was turned into a pillar of salt. So it goes. That's a good phrase to write up here. I was going to use the whiteboard. It's like a virgin whiteboard. It's like skiing fresh powder at Vail. So it goes. This was used every time something dies in this book, including a glass of water. At one point he says the glass of water was dead. So it goes. Because it was old. There's a point where it goes. You know when he first uses it in the book is when he's talking about Gerhard Mueller, that taxi driver. And he's like, Gerhard wished me peace, and we had a nice time. Oh, and his mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. And what's really going on is Kurt Vonnegut is trying to deal with this. I thought a lot about how this book is still relevant today. We know a lot about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and this is a deeply autobiographical book about dealing with post-traumatic stress, witnessing Dresden. Vonnegut's other books are more sort of outlandish critiques, but this is about him. Here's something I learned reading it the second time. So that first chapter is a masterpiece. I think it may be my favorite first chapter of any book, because he just lays out everything that's coming, and in very subtle ways sometimes. He says on page 20, he's trapped in an airport. He can't fly out. And so he's in this hotel room and he's looking at the clock. And he says, time would not pass. Somebody was playing with the clocks, and not only with the electric clocks, but with the wind-up kind too. The second hand on my watch would twitch once, then a year would pass. and then it would twitch again. And that's kind of an interesting detail, but you're not really sure why he's doing that. And then later, I think this is page 77, you figure out why. Anybody know? Anybody know where he references that later in the book? I did not know that until I've read this book 10 or 20 times, and I did not pick up on this until I was preparing for this. So there, on this horrible train ride across Germany, people are dying, they're not being fed enough, they're stuffed in this boxcar. This really happened. And he's talking about the train's just moving really slowly because it's not a priority. Right? They're letting the military trains through, and he says, it was black in the car and black outside the car, which seemed to be going about 2 miles an hour. The car never seemed to go any faster than that. It was a long time between clicks, between joints in the track. There would be a click, then a year would go by, and then there would be another click. And what's happening is Kurt Vonnegut's in that hotel room 20 years later watching that clock tick, and he can't stop thinking about that train. Of course, the most moving image of that, here's a phrase I'll write on the board: mustard gas and roses. Anybody remember that from the book? It's a very moving image from that book. Comes up in the first chapter, he says, I have this disease late at night involving alcohol and the telephone. And what he's really revealing there, too, is that he's drinking as a result of this experience. I drive my wife away with a breath like mustard gas and roses, and then speaking eloquently into the telephone, I ask the operator to connect me. It's very old school technology. We don't use the Bell telephone system like that anymore, right? And that image comes up, I think, 4 times in the book. The second reference is on page 7, just a couple pages later. Oh, he's talking about his dog, and he's like, my dog doesn't mind the smell of mustard gas and roses. And you're like, that's kind of an interesting image, but where's that from? And then later, Vonnegut appears in his own book. Monica, this is going to be a question that you can answer. But on page 73, Billy Pilgrim is sort of the main character. He's kind of an almost stand-in for Kurt Vonnegut. I don't think Kurt Vonnegut is quite as pathetically helpless. But Billy Pilgrim does some things that Kurt Vonnegut does. He describes Billy Pilgrim crying in a sort of non-vocal way. That's why one of the dedications is the cattle are lowing. How's the hymn go? The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. And he's talking about this Billy Pilgrim will sometimes just find himself crying in this quiet, private way. I promise you that was Kurt Vonnegut. Anyway, Billy's in his house and stuff's happening, and all of a sudden this happens. Billy answers. There was a drunk on the other end. Billy could almost smell his breath, mustard gas and roses. It was the wrong number. Billy hung up. There was a soft drink bottle on the windowsill. Its label boasted that it contained no nutritional value. Meant more consumerism critique. So that's Vonnegut entering his own book. And Monica, is it correct that that's a postmodernist literature technique in which the author, I don't know if anybody knows, it doesn't have to be more.
I would say that it is, in that you have examples of, like, The Hobbit, where you have narrators interacting. And Andrea's sitting in front of me going, no,
Tristram Shandy.
Yeah, I mean, no.
18th century.
Yeah, so it isn't just postmodern. Sometimes authors enter their own story.
But it's more common in post.
It's more common.
Literature, absolutely that.
It probably has a different effect today, for sure.
Yeah. To me, it has the effect in this story of jarring us back to reality. That this isn't some wild story about Billy Pilgrim. This is about Dresden. And when I think the funniest Kurt Vonnegut book is Breakfast of Champions. Doesn't mean the best, but Breakfast of Champions. And my favorite example of him doing this is at the end of Breakfast of Champions, he enters his own novel, and he's having a cocktail in a cocktail bar. I'm going to put on a pair of sunglasses for a minute. So he's wearing sunglasses in this cocktail bar, and the waitress comes up and says, "Can you see anything with those sunglasses on in here?" And Kurt Vonnegut says, "The big show is inside my head." And I completely understand that. It's true. He's also, of course, there's a lot of schizophrenia in this book. His mom was schizophrenic. He was schizophrenic. His son has written a book about his experience with schizophrenia called The Eden Express. So there's mustard gas and roses. Okay, that's kind of... Then at the end of the book, you find out why. This is in the last chapter. And they're talking about, one of the things Kurt Vonnegut got to do was excavate these corpse mines in Dresden. So the city's been destroyed. And these American prisoners of war, you can imagine what hell that would be, right? Let's march. Well, so these Americans get marched into this city, and they have to excavate these corpse mines, dig these people out. At first, the bodies were, they didn't smell, he says. It was like a wax museum, but later they liquefied, and the smell was like mustard gas and roses. And that's where you know that image is from. And he has carried it with him. Maybe I should I do this? Here, I'll show you just a little bit of him talking about that part of his life. We'll make this a multimedia experience. I think I have this ready. Where are we at? 18. I definitely want to leave time for discussion. Oh. I think I have this ready. This is a BBC documentary, about the 20th minute.
What she said was, you were only children then. So I made my heroes the children that I had in fact been, and all my friends had been over there, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. The thing worked. There were sounds like giant footsteps above. Those were sticks of high explosive bombs. The giants walked and walked. A guard would go to the head of the stairs every so often to see what it was like outside. Then he would come down and whisper to the other guards. There was a firestorm out there. Dresden was one big flame. The one flame ate everything organic, everything that would burn. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. Many holes were dug at once. Nobody knew yet what there was to find. There was no machinery. Not even horses or mules or oxen could cross the moonscape. A German soldier with a flashlight went down into the darkness, was gone a long time. When he finally came back, he told a superior on the rim of the hole that there were dozens of bodies down there. Thus began the first corpse mine in Dresden. There were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. They didn't smell bad at first, were wax museums, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. So it goes. And so that's what we were doing, is we became corpse miners, and this was an enormous labor, and after a few days had gone by, it was obvious that we weren't going to get nearly all the people out, so a new technique was worked out where we would dig in, open up an air raid shelter, go looking for one, open it up, shine a light in there, that's indeed what it was, and then a German soldier would go down with a flamethrower and cremate the bodies there. But I have, in my time, for a brief period, dealt in enormous numbers of bodies, and seen these spectacular pyramids of corpses alternating with wood.
One thing to keep in mind is this book's being written in the middle of the Vietnam War. And part of its popularity was that there were a lot of people very frustrated with that war at the time. And he references that at the end of the story. I think that's all I have of that. All right, what's next? Again, this whole PSTD theme, obviously I'm grafting the values of our time onto the story in some extent, but when he talks about his daughters looking at that river, and he describes it in its long, narrow, unsalted, then he says, there were carp in there as big as atomic submarines. And that's not a very appealing image for fish. But it is an image of somebody who's experienced this and is living, and the young kids in the room probably don't think that much about nuclear holocaust, but we used to think about it a lot. Young kids, young adults. I call on my friends kids sometime. Kids, if you turn out the light, the moths will stop coming. I would be remiss without mentioning the Tralfamadorians. The Tralfamadorians. These are the aliens. This is sometimes called the science fiction book. I don't think that's quite right, but he's using science fiction for a reason. The Tralfamadorians are hilarious. They look like plumber's helpers, right? They have a little suction cup at the bottom and a stick, and then they have a little hand on the top with an eye in it. And when you're saying something stupid, they close the hand. Vonnegut says very clearly in the book why he's using, so this whole science fiction technique, that's what in literature is called a conceit, or sort of an extended structural device used to tell a story. And the Tralfamadorians can move forward and backwards in time, and they can go visit any moment in their life they want. So I'm already dead, but I can also go visit Easter in 1968. And I'll get, at the end, I'm going to talk about why he does that, but he's certainly quite clear. Vonnegut has a couple of alter egos in his stories. One is Elliot Rosewater, and the other is Kilgore Trout. This is about Elliot Rosewater. Again, he's sort of writing about two sides of himself in one paragraph. Rosewater was twice as smart as Billy, but he and Billy were dealing with similar crises in similar ways. They had both found life meaningless, partly because of what they had seen in the war. Rosewater, for instance, had shot a 14-year-old fireman, mistaking him for a German soldier. I don't know if that really happened, but things like that certainly do happen in war. So it goes. And Billy had seen the greatest massacre in European history, which was the firebombing of Dresden. So it goes. So they were trying to reinvent themselves and their universe. Science fiction was a big help. That's why he uses science fiction. He could not tell this story. And then he sort of hit upon science fiction, and it helped him write it. My favorite scene in the book is the bomber scene. So part of what the Tralfamadorians allow Billy Pilgrim to do is to move backwards in time. And there's a scene where he watches a World War II bomber movie backwards. And it's just fabulous. So there's all these shot up bombers in England with a bunch of dead crewmen on them. And they take off backwards. And they fly backwards to Germany. And these German fighters come up and they have this magical power. They can suck the lead out of the planes and the crewmen and make them all good again. And the bombers get over the city, and these cities are in flames and they're in ruins, and the bombers have this magical ability to compress all of that destruction into these 500-pound cylinders and then pull those cylinders up into the bombers. The Germans have magical tubes where they're pulling more lead out of the planes and the crewmen. And then the planes fly backward. There's still a few dead and wounded crewmen, but fighters come up and suck all the lead out of them, make everything right again. And here's my favorite part of that passage. Another of Vonnegut's Judeo-Christian references here, page 75. When the bombers got back to their bases, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did the work. The minerals were shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly, so they would never hurt anybody again. The American flyers turned in their uniforms, became high school kids, and Hitler turned into a baby. That wasn't in the movie. Billy was extrapolating. Everybody turned into a baby, and all humanity, without exception, conspired biologically to produce two perfect people named Adam and Eve. And that's, you know, this is one of the most banned books of the 20th century. And on the surface, people ban books because it's got dirty words in it. There's this reference to a pornographic picture throughout the book. Where is that? Page 34. This is one of Kurt Vonnegut gets captured in the Battle of the Bulge. That's what this is about. Billy Pilgrim gets shot at, and he's the kind of guy who's like, well, you missed. Let me give you another shot. And then he's with this horrible human being named Roland Weary, who thinks all day long about torture and torture devices. And Roland Weary and the scouts were safe in the ditch, and Weary growled angrily at Billy, "Get out of the road, you dumb motherfucker." The last word was still a novelty in the speech of white people in 1944. It was fresh and astonishing to Billy, who had never fucked anybody, and it did its job. It woke him up and got him off the road. So on the surface, people ban this book because the word fuck is in there. And I apologize for just using it 3 times. That was obviously for effect. I don't speak like that in my classroom. One of my favorite Kurt Vonnegut phrases is, what the world needs is more common decency, civility. And in this space, I mean, when I'm watching the Spurs play, I drop plenty of F-bombs. It's fun. But in a professional environment, that's not appropriate, I don't think. It's about respect. So on the surface, people think they're banning this book because it's got words like that in it. But the real reason they're banning this book is he just indicted this whole myth we have about how American women helped us win World War II. And some of that's true. But how he turns that around and says, touchingly, it was the women who dismantled these bombs. That just turns that whole World War II myth on its head, and that's subversive. And that's the real reason the book was banned, was that it eats at the foundation of some of the most important myths of our society. That's why people really don't want it read, because it's a threat. Let's take it. Can we show the Kurt Vonnegut doll now, please? Here. Nice. There he is. Modern Mark Twain. I've never met anybody with a Kurt Vonnegut doll before. Where'd you get it?
He was a gift because I'm a Vonnegut freak. So.
Well, you know, like me, you probably will spend your whole life quoting phrases from Kurt Vonnegut. What the world needs is more common decency. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes.
Our dad, we're brother and sister, so our dad has actually a funny story about meeting Vonnegut at a book signing. He went to the book signing and he took his copy of Cat's Cradle because that's one of his favorites. And everyone, I forget what the question is, but Kurt Vonnegut just expects everyone to ask this and he answers boringly. But my dad, he had a really interesting question about Cat's Cradle because he's one of those people who just thinks about the book the entire time he's reading it, and he thought, his speculation was that the main character of Cat's Cradle, his name is mentioned but is never said. He thinks that the main character is named John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt. Because in one of the scenes, one of the guys was looking at the grave and said, "I pity the person who has that last name." And the main character says, I don't, because that name is my name too. So he started thinking, maybe that's John Jacob. So he went up to Kurt Vonnegut, and Kurt Vonnegut was signing his book, and he said, in this book, is the main character named John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt? And Kurt Vonnegut puts down his pen and begins to howl with it. And he said, Kurt Vonnegut said, you know, I've never really thought of a name, but that's the best one I've heard so far. And about a week later, during an interview, Kurt Vonnegut said, the best part about writing a book is that people will form their own opinions, and that's what I love. And my cousin called my dad and said, he's talking about you.
Right. That's beautiful. Sorry?
Now I have to sing the song. I think we should.
John Jacob Jingleheimer, right? You know, that raises a very interesting point about literature. Paul Krugman taught me this, talking about John Maynard Keynes. Paul Krugman is a very smart economist. You should read his stuff. And people are asking him what Keynes really meant. And Krugman says, it doesn't really matter what Keynes meant. It matters what we make of it. Now, it matters to literary scholars what Kurt Vonnegut really meant, and I respect that. And Krugman tells a joke about a guy in a museum is looking at a painting of George Washington, and he goes over to the curator and says, is that what Washington really looked like? And the curator says, that's what he looks like now. And what matters is what we make out of this book. I'll tell you what I think is, I mean, war is still happening, and so is plain old death, but there's a moment at the end of this book. Vonnegut's with Bernard V. O'Hare, and they're reading the newspaper on an airplane, and one of them says, I read there will be 7 billion people in the world one day. And Kurt Vonnegut says, I suppose they'll all want dignity. And we're reckoning with that today in Ferguson, with Syrian refugees, with our, in my time, we've sort of won the battle with our homosexual sisters and brothers, but we're working on it now with transgender people, right? Everybody expects dignity, right? Let me wrap this up. I've got, fortunately, more than... So, you know, the last thing, another Kurt Vonnegut phrase that I say all the time, if this isn't nice, what is? And that's part of his Trafalmadorian technique, is the Trafalmadorians advise him, look, you've got good parts and bad parts of your life. Try to focus on the good parts. And being in a room with a bunch of people who've read a book and getting to talk about it, that's about as good as it gets for me. So I say that a lot. If this isn't nice, what is? I want to say one last little side note. I found this book in a bookstore 2 days ago by coincidence. If anybody ever wants to read this, there is a letter at the very start of this book that Kurt Vonnegut wrote a month after the end of the war. He typed it out. Where is it? He's talking about Dresden. And you know how he says, and so it goes over and over again. Kurt Vonnegut says other things over and over again, and so on to infinity. And what he says in this over and over again is, but not me. He talks about most of his unit getting killed in the Battle of the Bulge, but not me. That train going to Dresden got strafed by Allied planes, and about 150 POWs got killed, but not me. Dresden happens, and all these people get killed, but not me. He's sort of repeating that. You can sort of sense where he's coming from. So, I think that's all I have to say about the book, or at least all I prepared. Is there anything that anybody else would like to discuss about the book? Something else that struck you? Or, for example, he talks a lot about free will. Do you think we have free will? Because Kurt Vonnegut doesn't. The Trafalmadorians are like, this is all, the future's just set in amber. We're bugs in amber. And he sort of, it's either our nature or our nurture, but otherwise I'm programmed to stand here at this moment.
By the very nature of having written the book and trying to make sense of those instances, he contradicts himself because it is in making sense of what happens that one expresses free will. Tell us what you want to freeze that in the moment in time.
Unless of course what?
You want to put that in a moment in time too, in which it occurs.
Yeah, and the problem with that model is that it's infinitely elastic. That's a great old Peter Gabriel line, see me stretch for God's elastic acre. And when something's infinitely elastic, it kind of doesn't have any, you could make it say anything, right? You just build a bigger model with more nature and more nurture. Anybody else? The Tralfamadorians don't think about free will. Yes, Alex?
Well, I find it interesting toward the end of the book when they're talking about how they see the world ending, this test pilot trying to find fuel. And I find it interesting, going back to, when the moon was turned to a color of salt. When we know how the world ends, wouldn't you feel that it's your duty to prevent that as a human? And the Tralfamadorians, what happened? It's programmed that.
Or, yeah, they sort of think it's just always happened. Yes?
Due to the theoretical laws of time, the more you try to stop something from happening, the more it will begin to happen. But that's all theory.
Maybe. The Tralfamadorians say very clearly, we visited 32 planets, and only on Earth is there any talk of free will. I disagree. I was in a book club 2 weeks ago and said the most important issue that we face is climate change. I believe that very strongly. Vonnegut has a lot to say about the environment, by the way. In Breakfast of Champions, there's a race of cars, and they eat petroleum and pee gasoline, and it's destroyed their planet. And so they come to Earth, and then they wreck our planet. I need to mention Kilgore Trout. I didn't mention Kilgore Trout. Kilgore Trout is another conceit that Vonnegut uses, and I'm pretty sure I know why. So Kilgore Trout is a really bad science fiction writer. But what he's got are interesting ideas. And I saw Kurt Vonnegut talk twice. I saw him speak at the University of Texas at Austin, and I saw him talk here in Kansas City, down on the Unity Temple. Did you see that talk? The baby was crying, and he said, somebody shut that kid up! So sometimes you can have two public figures saying those, but meaning very different things. I'm just saying hypothetically. Kilgore Trout, the reason that Vonnegut uses, I've heard Vonnegut say, a lot of times I'm reading a book and about a third of the way through I go, okay, I got it. I know the point you're trying to make. And that's what he does with Kilgore Trout, is he tells a whole story in a paragraph. There's a paragraph in this book where he says, Trout wrote a story about a money tree. The leaves were $100 bills, and the fruits were diamonds, and people killed themselves trying to get to the tree, and they made excellent fertilizer for the tree to grow and grow. That's great. That's a whole story in a paragraph that I use in my economics class, because that's pretty clever. Back to free will. You don't tell your sons to not participate in massacres unless you think you can influence the future, right? And I've heard him sort of talk about wanting to take his kids to art museums and expose their brains to beautiful pictures so that they would develop different brain connections than, I don't know, taking them to Saw 4, something violent, right? Is there more? I think that's all I have, folks. Anyone else?
One of my favorite things about Vonnegut is how all of his stories seem to have some common nugget that's pulled from another story. So the radio broadcaster from Mother Night has a cameo in this story. The the allusions to diamonds and emeralds and people's mouths, which is repeated over and over again, and Bluebeard plays a role in this story. The allusions to mass death, which he details the Armenian massacre in Bluebeard, and that's where the diamonds and stuff come in, but that plays a role here. You see these little nuggets. It's like he's trying his entire career to write his way out of his experience in Dresden. It's not just this book. Frankly, I think it's everything he wrote, is this attempt to come to terms with what he saw and did and put his hands on when he was stuck in that bunker. So that's one of my favorite things about Vonnegut. It's like every time you pick up another Vonnegut book, you find an old friend from another Vonnegut book. And you get this little sense of warm fuzzy, and you're like, oh, Uncle Kirk, he did it again. You know, you reminded me again of that old story. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I've just loved Vonnegut for years and years.
Yeah, Cat's Cradle is about the destruction of the world. Vonnegut worked for GE after the war, and his brother learned how to make it rain by sprinkling clouds. And he talks about that. There's a nonfiction book that he has called Fate's Worse Than Death. It's a bunch of speeches. And in one of these speeches, he's talking at MIT, and he's talking about, to these engineering students, about, we're all terrified of what you're going to invent, that you're going to invent Armageddon. And he's like, in fact, the most effective doubter of unbridled technological progress in human history was a woman, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And he's like, to show you what a fruity liberal I've become, if I were president of MIT, I'd hang pictures of Boris Karloff all over the institution. To remind you people that we all cower in muted dread at what you're going to invent next. And so there's a lot of social activism. Another book that's very popular is Galapagos. I talked to some old friends before I was going to give this talk, and the line that one of them likes. In Galapagos, there's a nuclear war, and humanity evolves into sort of sea otters. Somebody combines the last man on Earth's sperm with a female sea otter in this new species. They're intelligent like us, but they're sea otters. And he says, it's hard to oppress other people when you just have flippers. So there's this sort of constant social critique. Anyway, thanks for coming. Feel free to stop by.